Hi, my name is Tom Smith, and I am a game designer. I have worked on a lot of games in a lot of different places and a lot of different styles. So I've worked in board games, I've worked on console games, I've worked on mobile games, and I'm currently working at Roblox building weird assessment games. So I build games that are part of our hiring process, that measure cognitive skills. It's a whole thing. If you want to know more about that, talk to me later. I also teach at Moorpark College. So I teach one class on game design, and I like to talk about games in that class, and we do a lot of back and forth. So I have some teaching experience, but mostly my experience is from the entertainment games field and a little bit of educational games. So I want to talk about what games are and how they work and the sort of basic ideas of games. So part of this is so that I can get these ideas out there for people who don't think about games as much as I do. But I also want to talk about these in the context of education and how this is how kids are thinking. Tammy's keynote earlier was talking about how, you have to understand this is something that 97% of the kids these days do. It pervades how they think about the world. So interactivity, these things are really important for everyone. And that's something that I think can be used to make everything better. So I want to start just so I understand and can balance the talk a little bit. Who here is educator? Who here is an educator? We have a few educators. Who here is a game developer? A lot of game developers. And who here is something else? All right, we got some good something else's. Okay, so I can angle it up a little bit in terms of my game design talk, but I'll keep it balanced for everybody. Okay, okay, I calibrated that, I'm good now. Okay, so first, what is a game? That's kind of where I want to start from. And I take a very broad definition of games. When I talk about games, I like to talk about everything. I like to consider everyone a gamer if they play anything that is game related at all. Because there's a lot of games out there. We often start our game discussions in video games. We talk about PC games, we talk about console games, and these are a place where we start. And these have nice, pretty graphics. These are things that people notice when they look at these, but the core of the game is true whether you're on any sort of device. If you're on random handheld device, if you're on your phone, these are still games. These are still, and honestly, if you're interested in games, these are the games that people are spending the most money on these days. Mobile games are as big as everything else combined in terms of how you make money. So if you're a student looking to get into games, play some Candy Crush because that's more likely to be what you're going to be working on than World of Warcraft. Games also include tabletop games, board games, role-playing games. Anything in which there's this level of interaction is a game. And these are all have the same ideas underlying them, and that's kind of what I'm going to talk about. And they can be good sources of inspiration. They can be good ways to use games in different ways. And even outside of this, playground games, sports, games are everywhere. Games are all sorts of different things. If you like watching football, you like watching games. If you like playing, random card games, you like playing games. These are all games, and these all share a lot of the same qualities. So the key quality that they share is that they're interactive. You, as the player, do something that has a consequence that determines who wins and who loses, or determines some form of victory. This is sort of the key concept of games and what makes games different than everything else. So for this to work, the game has to have a verb. There's something the player does. I like just to talk about this as a verb, but it's really we're talking about interaction. When we talk about verbs, every game has some form of interaction, whether it's running and jumping in like a Mario game, or shooting in a first-person shooter, or bouncing a ball in basketball. These are all things you do that determine whether you win at the game or not. And this is something good to think about when you're trying to think about this in a classroom, is what are the verbs that you're using in your classroom? Is the verb just listen? Because that's not terribly interactive. A player listening is not something that engages them strongly in the activity. You want to find ways to get more verbs into the classroom. And this is something I try to do in my classes. I don't do as much as I would like, and I'm not as good at as I say I am when I stand up here, but like getting people engaged by asking them questions, getting people engaged by giving them activities, having little groups do things, all really important ways of getting people who are used to interaction to engage in your classroom. But this is how games are different than other media. So books, movies, things like that, you can't interact with. I can't change the result of Casablanca no matter how hard I try. But when I play a game, I can change at least some quality of the result. And this is really important to learning because interactivity is often how people learn. Again, Tammy's keynote, the slides about cats playing. This is learning. This is how, at our roots, even pre-human, this is how we learn, is by playing, by engaging, by interacting, and trying things and seeing what happens and learning from those results. So the more that you can get people interacting, the more they will learn. And so this is why I subtitled the slide, the lecture, as being a lecture on how lectures are terrible. Because you really need something to be interactive to really engage the sort of, everyone learns a little differently, but I think interaction is key for a lot of people for learning. And for learning to really, for the interaction to really matter, there have to be some consequences. It can't just be me asking a question, you thinking about it, and nothing happening. There needs to be some back and forth. And again, I'm gonna be a terrible example of it in this particular classroom, but when I teach, I try to engage people in questions and then guide that towards where we go in the class. So I'll ask them, a game that they're interested in, and we'll talk about that game. I'll ask them to come up with ideas for how to change the game, and we'll talk about those changes. That level of interaction where it's not just I ask a question and then we move on is actually really important. And so you can stop there and just say, okay, we're going to add some interactive qualities. We're going to play a little bit. We're going to do a little bit of engagement through interactivity. But you're not a game yet. And to really make a game out of an interactive experience, you have to make it more than just a toy. You have to make it have a goal. You have to make it have something that the player is working towards. And so you need rules and you need goals. Like if I'm bouncing a ball against a wall, I'm just bouncing a ball. But if I start counting how many times I catch it and I start making it a little more challenging by bouncing it in different ways, then it becomes a game. And so a lot of what happens to make something a game is happening inside players' heads, but that is something that is the key to being more than just play, is goals and structure and rules. And so this is true in all the different sorts of games you can think about. Video games, board games, playground games have rules, they have structure, they have goals. And one thing that is important here is once you add these rules, you are stepping outside of reality. Games are not real. Games are pretend. Games are imaginary. And rules are what make them imaginary. In Rules of Play by, it's a classic kind of textbook on games, they talk about the magic circle, which is a concept from anthropology, where you're defining a boundary around the game that separates it from reality. And that's really important and kind of weird, and but it's when we have to understand that games make sense to themselves and they don't make sense outside of that. And so like when you're setting rules, that doesn't necessarily mean you're making a game. Rules exist outside of games, rules exist in other places. It's when you're using rules to make these goals that tie into the interactivity, that build into an experience. And ideally an experience that is trying to be fun, trying to be engaging. If you're just setting rules for rules' sake, for gaining order or gaining control, that is different than setting rules for fun, setting goals for fun. And so that sort of creative, often social play is what makes a game a game. And so, I mean, it's kind of a little too easy to just say, make your classes engaging, make things fun. It's really hard to turn that into practical advice. But it is something just to keep in mind and keep as part of your goal while you're working on classes and while you're working on engaging students, is that this has to be something that affects your actions beyond just being a goal. It has to be something that you're actively working towards at all times. So different types of fun. Games aren't all the same sort of fun. Games can be social fun, they can be challenge fun, they can be really skill-based, random. There's a lot of different styles and flavors of fun, but games all kind of are united by this same quality. And still, that's another thing that breaks them off from reality. Reality is not very good at making things fun, which is a downside of reality and why people like focusing on games instead. In order to do this, you have to be challenging. Games that are too easy, experiences that are too easy are not engaging and fun. Games that are impossible or too difficult, also not fun. This ties into a psychological idea called flow, which is talking about this for all human activities. Game designers love this book because games are often an artificial creation of the same sort of flow state that people engage with in highly successful activities and important activities. Games are the fictional version of that, where you're making up a pretend world in which you get that same emotional, psychological, internal state. And this is kind of where you can see how like the difficulty curves that we think about when we're making games ties into this sort of psychological state. We want the game to be challenging, but not too challenging. We want the player to be pushed, but not too pushed. And we don't want it to be too easy. We don't want it to be too hard. So we often do this sort of like roller coaster up and down of there's a boss and then it gets easier and then there's another challenge and it gets a little harder after that. That's often how games work. And that's something that can tie back to classrooms is people want to be pushed. People want to be challenged. People don't want to just be given easy answers. They want a little, like, they might not admit it. They might cringe against it a little bit, but deep down, that is what engages people and makes them pay attention. And it can be especially challenging in a classroom where you have 20 or 30 kids of varying skill levels. And so that's a huge challenge. I totally understand. I experience it in my classes, but there's, providing different seeds for different skill levels can be something that can really engage. What engages one student may not engage the other student, but if you provide enough different seeds, it can engage them all by the end. The other thing is, in addition to challenge, people need uncertainty. If you know who's gonna win before you start the game, it's not very fun, it's not very engaging. I want that uncertainty and lack of clarity, which can often be challenging in a classroom where you're trying to provide very clear answers. You often want to be able to provide uncertainty as well. And so, I try not to ask questions in class that I already know the answer to. I try to ask about the students, what they're engaged in, what they're interested in, and that gets a much more of a dialogue going rather than just, who fought in the War of 1812. Not that I teach that, but if I did, I would want to engage you more in what would it have felt like to be in the War of 1812 or things like that. So another way to frame this is games are making decisions. So interaction, things that you can control based on rules. This is my rule book for Settlers of Catan. I wrote the first American rules. I'm very proud of them. So I just want to give them some love. In order to have fun, in order to be engaged and do whatever you consider to be fun, by overcoming a challenge. The challenge is important. If you don't have a challenge, it's not a good game. To achieve a goal, the goal is really important. If you don't have a goal, you're just a toy. And using imagination. The game happens in people's heads. It's not real, and that's part of what makes it a game. So, okay, that's part one. Part two is talking a little bit about how games are made and how that can relate back to the classroom. So, when we're talking about commercially released video games, there's a lot of different companies involved. You can, break this down in a lot of different ways, but I don't really care about that. I'm not talking about companies and money today. I'm more interested in who makes these games and how they make games. So there's a sort of standard set of jobs that you generally will have in most companies doing this. And then there's a bunch of other support jobs that are also important, but I'm not going to talk about as much. At the beginning, there's a programmer who's really making things happen. That is the person who translates the ideas into something that the player can experience. And there's a lot of different types of programmers. So a lot of different jobs at different companies that specialize in different things. And so there's a lot of different ways of approaching this. And this is something you can seed into your class. Let the students engage in problem solving. That's really what programming is. And let them engage in finding answers to difficult questions. And that's going to be much more interesting than just being given answers. Games are made by artists. Artists create the content that the programmers make come alive. And this is a process that involves many steps. There's a lot of different forms of creation. People who create the skeletons behind the models, behind the textures, behind the animations. It's a very long and involved process that I have a lot of respect for. At the bigger companies, these will each be a separate person. At a smaller company, it might be the same person doing all of these steps. And this was different in different places. There's different roles beyond these, but there's this sort of concept of this production pipeline that I find really interesting. I mean, this is something that you can do too, is just break things down, divide things step by step, but leave room for creativity. A good artist is going to add their personal touch to anything that they touch. And then there's game designers like myself. The game designer is responsible for making things fun and making things engaging, making the systems behind the logic that the programmer is setting up. So they spend a lot of time in spreadsheets often. And again, there's a lot of different specialties, a lot of different ways you can be a game designer. And a lot of documents that they write. This is something that I work on a lot in my class, is the different types of ways of expressing the ideas behind the game. But a lot of what game design is just identifying the underlying systems of the game. And this is something that I find really fascinating. I love systems. They're a passion of mine. And this is something that I think is important, just to expose people to not just the core ideas of something, but the underlying, like, why does this idea happen? How does this relate to other things that are happening? There's a lot of just underlying logic that game designers are the people who think the most on and really resonates in any field. And then there are producers who make things happen, who are sort of tracking the progress of the game. There's a lot of tools that people use. We talked about that a bit in the panel earlier. And so these are all really important to understand, but I'm going to kind of breeze by them because it seems like most of you have a good understanding of that to start with. And then we'll get to the how. So if those are the people that are making the game, what's the process they go through? How do they make the game? And one of the things I really want to emphasize is games are hard. Making a good game, or even making a bad game, is very challenging. Going from an idea to it's shipped, especially if you're talking about a console game or a PC game or one of these like big digital experiences. These have a lot behind them, and these are really hard to do. Every game that ships is a miracle, and I am grateful for every team that has gone through this and come out with a final product. But I want to kind of talk about why that is, because it seems like, okay, it's just, you know, a plumber jumping on mushrooms, whatever, how hard could it be? A lot of it isn't even the technology. A lot of it is the underlying game itself. Games are systems. Games are things interacting with each other. Games are complicated systems that have a lot of interconnectivity. Every action I take in the game has ripples through everything else going on in the game. If I'm engaging in combat with something, then that's going to affect my stats, which are going to then affect my next combat, which are going to affect my score, which is going to affect a variety of things. Even in a relatively simple game, there's these layers of thinking. And that's what attracts people to games, is this idea that my actions have consequences, and those consequences are meaningful in this larger system. And so gamers, even casual gamers, want fairly complicated systems, and they want these interesting systems that are uncertain. Like we said before, you don't want to know what the outcome is. A game like tic-tac-toe, I can understand the system very completely, and it's not very engaging. You need a game like chess, where there's a lot of different pieces, a lot of different moves. There's a kind of almost endless set of possibilities that, unless you're an AI, you're not really going to be able to understand. And they don't really understand anything, they just process them. So games inherently lean towards complex systems that are hard to predict, which means when you're making them, they're hard to predict, which means talking about them is really hard. So when you're designing the game, it's often by design that you can't figure out how everything's going to work ahead of time. Which means that the way to learn whether your game works or not is to play it, which means you have to build it first. So you have to kind of very quickly get to the point where you can see the game as its whole in order to understand how it works. Because just sitting there arguing about it with the rest of the people at your company is going to be fruitless. I've done it. It's, you know, kind of fun. I like having those discussions, but we rarely actually resolve anything. We resolve things when someone says, okay, give me a day, I'll go set it up in the build, and we'll see what happens. And that's when we actually answer the questions and get the team to agree on something. The other thing that's really important, well, do I have that on this slide or the next slide? That's on the next slide. These are a little out of order. I'll go to the slide first. In order to understand how that's working, you really need to do playtests. You need to put the game in front of people and understand how they're reacting. Because the people who understand the systems, the people who designed the systems and wrote the code, are often the worst people to play the game. They know everything already, so they are not going through the normal player process. The normal player process involves a lot of extra steps that if you don't pay attention to, you're going to lose your actual player base. Even for complicated games that are meant for advanced players, you can't just play with your own team. You have to put it in front of random people, see how they're doing. Don't tell them, don't give them any advice they wouldn't get outside of the box that they were if they bought the game in the end. And then see what they're doing, talk to them, pay a lot of attention to what they have problems with. Don't pay a lot of attention to solutions they propose to those problems, because they're good. The players are there to identify the pain points, not to design the game for you. You hopefully understand the game better than they do, and you can come to better solutions. And this is something that makes sense in the classroom too, iterating, thinking about what's working and not working, talking to the students about what works and what doesn't. And even in some cases, playtesting, even trying something new, putting it in front of some students and just getting some feedback before you start rewriting your whole syllabus. Also a good idea. So in order to do this quickly and efficiently, it's very important to prototype. It's very important to design the simplest execution of something you can. And I'm a big fan of using prototypes to answer questions, not to build the whole game and call that a prototype, but to just say, will people understand what button to press if we put this UI in front of them? And to prototype that, draw it on a piece of paper and put it in front of people and ask them that, okay, now you want to, buy a new item for your character, what button are you gonna press? That's a prototype. That gets you the answer you need to then go and implement the real version of that. It doesn't have to be that simple. It can be like a couple steps more. You can build a little board game version of the core interaction of your game and see if people understand the logic, if they understand the system, if they can make choices in the system that you want without having to build the interface and all the other pieces and the graphics and all those things. The quickest way you can get to an answer for your question is the best way to get there. I build prototypes in everything. I do paper, I do things in Google Sheets. I'll use off-the-shelf other game engines to try something out, to just see if my idea is gonna work, even if it's just a rough approximation. Machinations is a really good tool for testing out your economy. There's a lot of ways out there to get to your ideas quickly, answer your question, and then throw away everything you did and start over in the actual game. And to be clear, that's not the only form of prototype that exists. People use prototypes to test out how all your systems are going to interact together, which really is not a quick and easy prototype. That's a building out, I guess, cross-section of the game. There's a few different ways people do that. And they'll still use the word prototype. Our terminology in the industry is pretty terrible. We're very inconsistent with what we call things, but the type of prototype I'm a big fan of is quick answer, get out. And so this can be anything. So this is some students in my class prototyping a board game idea using a Monopoly set mixed with a Stratego set. And it got them to some answers really quick and it worked. So that's great. And the same thing in the classroom, just whatever it takes to get to an answer, to understand what type of interaction. Like there's certain things I do every class or that I do regularly in class, but they were things that I started out small. I wrote a book based on the dissections I do in class. Those are something that in my first couple years, I just did a few of them here and there, but they worked and I liked them. And so the students responded well, so I did more. And now I do them like basically every class, and it's something that I find really valuable, but it's something that took iteration to get to. Okay, so if that's how you make games, how do you make them good? A key thing is understanding your core loop. What does the player do in the game? What does the player want in the game? And what makes that challenging? Those are kind of the three key questions that I consider to be part of understanding the heart of the game. And that's what we mean when we talk about the core loop is, what is the thing that the player does over and over in the game? What is the thing that makes the game interesting and fun and engaging? What is the thing that everything else is built around? Because if you want to understand a game, this is what you have to understand. If you're, a game may have a really interesting progression system. It may have interesting events. It may have interesting visuals. Those are not what drives the game. Those are not what drive the interaction. this is the heart of the game, and everything else is supplemental. And some games have amazing supplements. Don't get me wrong, like a game with beautiful graphics, love it. But I still, if I want to know if I want to buy the game, if I want to play the game, I need to know what I'm going to do. I need to know what is the thing that I'm constantly doing that is engaging and exciting for me. And so this is something you can break down in basically any game. There's like a key thing you do that you do over and over again, and that's what makes it fun. And that's important to understand about any game you're doing, any game. If you're thinking about, throwing games in your classroom, understand what is the key driving force behind them. And also just think about your class. Think about, what does the player do in the class? What does the player want in the class? What makes this class engaging and learning? I think I honestly like sitting down and writing some of this talk. It's making me rethink some of the ways I do my class, because I like thinking about my class as verbs. I'm dissecting my class now, the way I dissect games, and it's leading me to some good ideas. Once you've got that, you then need to progress from there. So if you're just doing the same core loop over and over and over again, it's going to get boring. You need to have a core loop that advances and progresses and becomes something new. And this can be in all sorts of different ways. This can be through content. You can have different levels and enemies that engage the player in slightly different ways. This can be through the player's abilities, the player learning new things and their character leveling up. And RPG systems are a very common way of doing this that people enjoy and that keeps people engaged. You can mix up, you can do different forms of content. You can have it all be handcrafted. You can have it be procedurally generated. But you need some way that, like, the first time I play it is different than the 30th time and different than the 300th time. And that's something that keeps it from just being a game that I play once and put away. You can be a game that has no progression. A lot of like very, classic board games don't have any progression system. You play it once, it's going to be the same as the next time. But this is where the games that I keep coming back to as board games are the ones that have some randomization to them or some quality that is different based on the strategies I'm choosing or the players I'm playing against. That's what makes me come back and want to play it over and over again. And so this, again, can be different things for different games. Randomization is really helpful because that means I'm going to have a different experience every time. Special rules that I can like put my own flavor on. Foursquare is a game where I have a sort of almost a personalization layer of choosing what rules apply each round. And this is true for classes too. How is the 30th class different than the first? How is every class a little different? What are the things that make this class stand out? When I teach, about halfway through the class, we play D&D. And that's something I kind of build to. Anticipation is also a great psychological trick that, they know what's coming, they're interested in it, and that's something that makes that class unique, that particular week. So these are good things to be playing around with. When you're making a game, that's kind of the two key components is you need the core loop and the progression, but your choices about what core loop and what progression you're going to do are going to depend a lot on your players. You're going to have to understand your audience. What do they want? What are they interested in? What makes them excited to come and play this game? And can be simple. Sometimes a lot of people make games that they want to play, and that's great. And that's a place to start. If you're making games for very young people, that's going to be a little different. I make games, or I work in Roblox. I make games in Roblox. I advise people on making games in Roblox. Most people playing games in Roblox are not 30-year-old game developers. Most of them are 10 and playing with a bunch of their friends. And their play patterns are strange to me. They are not the ways that I played games when I was 10. But it leads to these very interesting sorts of games that succeed on the platform that are different than anywhere else. Roblox is an inherently social platform, and that leads to inherently social games, which I find as a game designer really interesting and different than anything I've seen before. And it's just kind of fun and engaging for me to see what works and doesn't on the platform. And when you're looking at players, it's also important to not just look at demographics. I totally fell into my own trap there and told you 10-year-olds are different. But it's more about the play pattern. It's 10-year-olds in groups that are playing socially. That's kind of more important than the fact that they're 10. At 10, maybe they are a little different than 30-year-olds. But it's not about demographics, it's about interests. It's about what they're looking for, how they play, what they're trying to get out of the game. that's really the type of player you want to look for. Understanding, age and gender and those sort of things, whatever. Understanding what drives them, that's what you care about. And again, this is the same thing Tammy was talking about in the keynote earlier. Understand your players, understand the people in your classroom. I teach community college. I teach a lot of people who are in a game program. I teach people who are in a game program, which means a lot of them are more dedicated gamers. One of my first assignments is always having them ask me questions. I have them ask me 20 questions in a homework assignment and I answer them. But my secret reason for doing that is not that it's good for them to understand, like they can get some questions answered. It also tells me what they're interested in. It tells me, how many of the kids are really passionate about art, or how many are really, hardcore gamers versus casual gamers, because it'll usually come up in the questions they ask, the games they'll ask about, the sorts of jobs they'll ask about. And so that helps me understand and guide my instruction towards the sorts of things they're interested in. I call this out just because it's hard as a game developer. First-time user experience tutorials are hard. And a lot of games get them wrong. A lot of games do them poorly. Again, calling back to the keynote, Tammy was calling out, nobody wants to read your tutorial. No one wants to read anything, really. And so a lot of the best games are teaching through the game itself. So while you're playing, you're being exposed to the things that you need to learn, and you're kind of learning them just naturally. Like the Mario 1-1, the first level in Super Mario Brothers, is considered a classic of this because it does a really nice job of just presenting challenges to you that logically are solved through the actions they want you to learn. And that's something that's really great and important. It's not always possible in truly educational spaces. I build assessment games, and this is like the biggest point of contention between me and my learning scientists experts is they want to make sure everyone learns the same things, and I want people to have fun while learning, but whatever. That's me complaining about my job. So teaching comes in very different forms, but it's always important and something you want to think about when you're thinking about your game. And again, think about this in your classroom too. Think about, how am I exposing people to new ideas? If I'm doing something new that we haven't done before, how am I training the students? How am I getting them used to the idea and helping them understand what they're doing and why they're doing it? One thing that I talk about a lot in my class that I'm very passionate about is understanding the themes of games, understanding what this game is about. Games are about things. Games are art. Art has meaning. A lot of games are commercial art, which means that sometimes it is harder to find the themes because sometimes the theme is we wanted to make a bunch of money. But even in those games, there's something underlying it. The people building it were not just cashing their paychecks. They wanted to say something. They were thinking about things while they were making it. They were trying to say something. And it's always going to come through. I like talking about Pac-Man. Pac-Man is not a game that I believe had a strong authorial intent behind it, but I find it a fascinating glimpse of the 80s. It's this bright, glowy thing where you have to move the whole time. You're constantly under threat, and you have to just consume and consume and consume. And it came out the same time that consumerism really took off under Reagan in the 80s, and this idea of this culture of consumerism. And I don't think they intended it that way, but I think part of the reason it succeeded as a game as much as it did was that it struck a vibe that was in the zeitgeist at the time. And that is what the game is kind of about, at least to me. And that is something that even if people didn't consciously think, oh, this game looks like consumerism, it still influenced in the back of their head. I think it made a difference. And so, you can find this in pretty much any game. Some games really are front and center where, it's clear that they were intending this. I talk about Papers, Please in the book as a game that really does a great job of having a theme and expressing it to you and making you live it, which is great. But even if that's not the main goal, the main reason why the game exists, it's still there. And this is something that you want to think about for your class too. Understand what your class is about. Obviously it's on a topic, it's got a syllabus, it's got learning goals, but even deeper than that, is there a meaning behind it that you're trying to get across, that you're thinking about, that pervades everything else that you're doing? Okay, and then the last bit is talking about why you would want to use games in these different places. Humans like games. Humans like imagination, we like rules, we like fun. These are all things that motivate humans. And games can be used in a lot of different ways to hit these different goals. It can be used to teach people things. It can be used to make a point. It can be used to raise awareness of things. And this is, I think, really important and something that I'm excited to see games moving more and more towards, and do whatever I can to help. But with specifically for educational games, I think a lot of these same rules apply. These are games, but you also have this other side of there's learning objectives that you're trying to get across. You're trying to hit a learning goal. And this can be two separate things. This can be, there's a game and then there's some learning goals. And that's how a lot of educational games that I've seen kind of approach it, the Math Blaster kind of way, where there's math and then there's some pretty graphics around math. I'm not a huge fan of this. I find like separating your fun and your learning is not ideal. You want to merge them. You want to integrate them. You don't want broccoli and chocolate. You want something that is intended to be delicious all the way through. You want the things that the actions you're performing, the verbs that are the game, to be the things that teach you the things that are your learning goal. So like in a theoretical example, a Math Blaster version of Spider-Man would be, enemies are approaching you and you type in the number to answer the math problem, and then that defeats the enemy. This is division. This is math and a game, and the math is what you're doing. The math is the action. It's the interaction. And Spider-Man is just a visual layer applied on top. This is basically the same as aliens and spaceships, but the interaction is the same. It's just different visuals. So if you really wanted to do this right, and I'm not saying that this is a great game design, you need to start blending them together. And like my quick off-the-cuff example of this is, what if like I needed to understand how many enemies there are in order to know what combat move I'm supposed to do? Spider-Man, the Insomniac game, is a lot about there's like 5 different ways of fighting things and you have to choose the right one for the right enemy. So what if that was a math problem? If the number of enemies is what determines what attack I should use, and there's ways that like visually, like it's presenting me the number of enemies, but not in a clear direct, here's the number is 10. It's showing me 3 and 7. Now I have to process that and know, okay, 3 plus 7 is 10. So I should do attack Y, not attack A plus B. Anyway, this is getting a little too elaborate here, but basically integrating the two things so that the action I'm taking requires the skill rather than be separate. So here the verb is Spider-Man. I'm doing my combat actions, but I am using math to make that successful. So math helps me win rather than math and the game being two separate actions. So then, yeah, that makes math fun. Yay, math. So a good educational game will have fun, it will have learning. And in order to make these two the same thing, you have to find the verbs that support your learning objectives. And this, you can basically brainstorm a bunch of possible game verbs, list out verbs that might work in a game, list out verbs that relate to your learning objectives. Here I was thinking about genetics. So I wrote a bunch of verbs that would have me doing genetics, have me learning about concepts in genetics. And there's going to be, a small overlap here. Most game actions aren't going to be ones that are going to teach me genetics, but that's okay. I can start to identify where there's links here, where there's verbs on one side that correlate to verbs on the other side. And then I can start to identify, there's games that use those verbs. So transforming, nurturing, planning, some math. These are all things that I can find in games, and then I can start linking them to concepts in the learning objectives. So there's genetics, there's games. I can start to draw those lines and connect those things up. And that's really where a good educational game is going to start. It's going to find actions that connect the learning and the game and start to build a game around that. And like one of the other things I want to emphasize here is it doesn't have to be a full commercial game. Once you identify these connections, that's going to give you a lot of ways to play with it. You can start by, tying a discussion to a game. Play this existing game. Play Adopt Me, and let's talk about how the pets demonstrate some of the things we've been learning in genetics. Make an activity based just on the choices. An activity can be really simple. It can just be saying, hey, here's some animals. Let's talk about how we might adapt them to this. Make a quick paper prototype, whatever, or spend $10,000 on making a full commercial game. It's up to you, but there's a lot of ways to take the concepts of games and use them in lectures, use them in small activities, use them in prototypes, and build whatever you want to build, and engage students that are used to games in ways that don't cost $100,000. And to be clear too, some things may not be able to be taught through games. That's okay too. Games are not a panacea. They don't work for everything. Some things are going to require more of a traditional method, but that gives you that diversity that you're looking for in your classroom. So making a game is very hard and expensive and complicated and stress-inducing. So if you can find another way to teach something, do that. Like, don't feel like you have to use a game for everything. But if you find something that you can make more engaging through interactivity, do that. It doesn't have to be complex interactivity. It can be simple interactivity. Ask the right questions. Build a little like card game based on just scribbling on some 3x5 cards. Whatever you can do to get that interactivity into your class, into your experience, into whatever you want to learn, do that. Because the interactivity is the key thing. That's what makes games exciting for people. That's what drives your students or yourself or whoever to really love games. The graphics and all that, it's nice, but it's just the sparkles on top. I like sparkles. Sparkles are great, but they're not the core. Games matter. Games are fun. Games are important. Think about how you're making your games. Think about especially your educational games. They're so hard. I love every game that comes out. And that's my talk. So I think we have a few minutes for questions. So if anybody has questions, please raise your hand and I'll answer. Yes.
Can you give an example of the playtesting process at Roblox and how you iterated based on the outcome?
So an example of the playtesting process at Roblox, the group I work with builds assessment games, which are very specific and very weird. We do a lot of think alouds. So we'll get a single person to play the game, an early version of the game, sometimes just pieces of paper, and we'll have them narrate their experience. Tell me what's going on in your head constantly. So we're looking for the thinking that we're trying to measure and see where that occurs. And the think aloud is a way that we can really expose that. We do I don't know, 3 to 5 of those a week for months on end, because that's really crucial to our process. That's not true for every Roblox games. That's just these assessment games. Every game developer handles it a little differently. When I worked at Disney, we would do a lot of play tests of where's my water levels with kids and just watch them play and see where they understood things and see where they didn't and see where just a little shift in something in the level could make it much easier for them to, not necessarily that we needed to make it easier, we just needed them to understand what was going on. So yeah, every game company I've worked at, we've done some version of that, some more robustly than others. Disney had a really strong process for that. Where I'm right now at Roblox has a really strong process for that. Some places I had to pull people kicking and screaming to get to fund that, or to even just do casual ones with friends and family. But it's so important at every step of the process. Yeah. Other questions? Yes. It really depends on the game, whether what becomes first in terms of the inspiration for the game. Because sometimes it doesn't have to be, you don't have to start in the core loop to make a good game. Sometimes someone will have a good idea for a new progression system. Someone will have a good idea for just a visual style. But the next step for me will always be, let's talk about what the core loop is going to be. If that isn't the initial inspiration, that's going to be the first thing I want to figure out is, if someone's pitching me a game, you might pitch me that, this is going to make money in a new way, or this is going to appeal to a certain audience or something. Great, I love that. Now tell me what the player is going to actually do that is going to reinforce that, and because that's all those cool new things only work if that core loop actually works. It doesn't have to be where you start, but it has to be one of the first places you go. Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the question is targeting age ranges versus targeting a broader sort of skill level for educational games. And I mean, I think for especially K through 12 education, we often think about age ranges um, just because that's how our educational system is organized. So, um, and I think when you're talking about, younger kids, it's more meaningful. The difference between a 10-year-old and a 12-year-old is very different than the difference between a 30-year-old and a 32-year-old. So um, I do think that basing it more on skills and understanding and the learnings, like this learning is built on this learning, is built on this learning, is built on this learning, is more important. But it does make sense to do that in the sort of, grade-based school system that we're working with. Um, I think once you get outside of that, then people are much more looking at skill-based of, if you're a language learner and you're doing a game that is teaching a language, you're going to start with just a skill-based. And you totally could do that even at a younger age, but um, it's kind of the system we're stuck with. So you kind of have to start from that as a discussion point. But really it is about what am I trying to teach more so than knowing exactly what age they are. Okay, more questions? I think I have a few minutes. Yes.
Can you talk a little more about designing assessment games and are there any things that you consider differently about designing for assessment?
Yeah, I mean, assessment games are weird. So it's very constrained by um, I need to build an experience that ideally is engaging, but really I need to get people to click to demonstrate what's happening in their head. So the think alouds help me see what's happening in their head, but then I need actions in the game that correspond to those thoughts. And that can be challenging because sometimes there will be strategizing that occurs that doesn't have an immediate action that just ripples into the next few actions. Um, One of the things I find really challenging with it too is like usually in a game you build these interesting layered decisions where all these different factors go into me deciding to do something. I'm doing this because it's going to help me 3 turns later and it's also going to give me this new resource and all these other things. That's really terrible for assessment because I don't know which of those factors you were thinking about. I need to boil down actions in the game to be really specific to specific thoughts, which is a pain and makes, as someone who loves like complicated systems, it really hurts me sometimes to boil them down like that. But yeah, I could go on for a while. I did a GDC talk on this a couple years ago. If you really want to hear me talk about this for 50 minutes, but assessment games are weird because we're kind of like an educational game, but we're also the opposite because we actively avoid educating you in any way because we just want to know what you already know. Like if I teach you something about the construct in the tutorial, then I've failed because then I'm not going to assess your actual skill. I'm going to assess what I taught you, which normally when you're building assessment in educational games, that's what you're doing is you're educating them and then assessing, now that I've educated you, where are you versus where were you when I started? So it's a strange beast, that this thing that I do. So yeah. Yeah, back there. I mean, I think we respond really well to simple. How is anticipation used in the classroom or in tutorials or in learning? And I think it's really easy to engage that part of people if you just kind of laying out at the beginning of a talk what you're going to be doing in the talk, and laying out the beginning of a lecture. Here's what we're going to be talking about, and after that, we're going to work on this project, and we're going to do this interactive experience. That's enough to get people much more engaged than just okay, I'm going to start talking now. And the same in a game, like just seeing things before you can interact with them, knowing that there's a progression system that has these things, knowing that there are abilities that are coming that I'm going to earn, knowing that there's, if it's a game, it's easy to put things that people want and that will make them excited as long as you actually pay it off later and give them the thing they want. If you can see a gold coin behind, on top of a tower and you don't know how to get on top of the tower yet, that's a good piece of anticipation for working towards that. It also gets into like layering your goals, having goals that overlap each other, but that's a whole nother lecture that I don't have I can't do in 2 minutes. So yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so building educational games for people of different abilities, people of different learning methods, and so forth. Um, I mean, a lot of that is just being thoughtful and testing things as you go. Core accessibility, um, like for standard disabilities, there's ways you can design around accessibility from the beginning, designing your interface so that it easily moves to fully click-based, designing your color palettes, designing all those sort of things. But even beyond that, I think it comes down to just having a team that is cognizant of these different challenges and opportunities, and planning that from the beginning, and doing occasional checks. With our assessments, it's something that's really important for us, because we really want to give everyone a fair chance at the job. So we'll do like an early concept test. There's an accessibility team at Roblox who we use for that sort of feedback. There's also just um, different approaches to problems, is something that we kind of struggle with, or talk about a lot, and try to make sure that we're giving everyone that fair chance. We for the assessments, we have a practice test that we release, and that's something that is there to help people who aren't as used to games, who maybe just need that sort of level of confidence. And that's something that I think can be done too, is like, if you're building an educational game, understanding just the range of students you're going to have, both in skill level and in different forms of learning and different things like that. So not making it like, I showed the difficulty curve there. You kind of have to expand your difficulty curve a little bit. You have to accept that some students aren't going to be able to meet the challenge as presented and might need a backdoor to get through it. And that there's nothing wrong with that. And as long as they can demonstrate the learning in another way, then you're good. And anybody else? Okay, I think we're basically at time. So I think that's good. Thank you, everybody.